When she was on the brink of life and death, frightened and knowing who had come to take her soul, the woman was shaken. It was an unexpected turn, and she couldn't believe that everything had happened so quickly. Just recently, everything was fine, and now she was facing something worse than the worst nightmare she could have ever dreamed. But the scariest part was that it wasn't an illusion, but hard reality, a reality that she had always rejected. Now she was left with no choice but to accept that there is a world beyond life, in which a person's soul undergoes incredible experiences. It all started on Friday, the 5th of May, 1995. Gloria Pola, a dentist, was driving with her husband and nephew to the library to get books for her dissertation. On the way back, a heavy rain surprised her. Gloria opened her umbrella and walked with her nephew under it, while her husband protected himself from the rain under the building edges. As they tried to jump over a large puddle, she was struck by lightning. The nephew died instantly, and Gloria suffered severe burns and lost consciousness. Her husband immediately called an ambulance, and she was rushed to the intensive care unit. Gloria Pola later described this moment. While my body was in the operating room, it felt as though my soul was traveling through a tunnel into another world. There, I was surrounded by a dazzling white light that radiated so much happiness that words could not describe it. In this state, I felt complete freedom from time and space. At that time, she didn't yet know what trials lay ahead of her, but she experienced a vision she would never forget. She saw all her loved ones who had already left this world. In the afterlife, the perception of people had completely changed for her. She said, "Before, I always focused on the external appearance of people. Who was fat, who was thin, who was beautiful." When she thought of her children, she suddenly found herself with them and tried to hug them, even though she was aware that she was in a bodiless state. But her 9-year-old daughter seemed to sense her presence. She smiled and softly said, "Mama." However, before Gloria Pola could respond to her daughter, an unknown force pulled her again to those wondrous places where she had been before. There, she met her nephew again, who had died from the lightning strike. He stood hesitantly before the beautiful gates that led to a paradise garden. Gloria realized that this was the entrance to paradise, a place so beautiful that no other place could ever compare. From the garden, golden light radiated, filled with divine love and warmth. In these rays of happiness, she wished to remain forever. The nephew turned around, smiled at her, waved goodbye, and entered paradise. Gloria Pola understood that, despite her desire to follow him, it was not yet her time to enter. And then, as if from a distance, she heard the voice of her husband. He begged her to fight for her life because she was needed for the children. In that moment, the vision disappeared, and Gloria found herself back next to her body, surrounded by doctors trying to bring her back to life. She spent a little time observing the events in the operating room, concerned about her condition. But soon she noticed several people around her. At first, she thought it was another medical team, but when she looked more closely, Gloria was horrified to realize that they were not humans. These beings were terrifying, their eyes burning with hatred. As she looked at them, she realized that they had come to take her soul. Panic took hold of her. She tried to return to her body, as if it would offer her refuge, but it was impossible. The body seemed to reject her. In that moment, a paralyzing fear gripped her. Gloria decided to flee. Her only hope was to escape from this desperate situation. But as she ran down the hospital corridor, she suddenly found herself in a completely different place. It was not the familiar corridor, but a long tunnel. And unlike what is often told, this tunnel did not lead to the light but to a dark, frightening area. The further she moved, the darker it became around her. At some point, she felt a solid surface beneath her feet. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, Gloria realized that she was standing on the edge of an abyss, from which an emptiness and despair emanated that was unbearable. When Gloria Pola looked into the abyss, she realized that if she fell, her soul would disappear forever into the oblivion of hellfire. In that moment, she understood why she was in this terrible place. It was the result of her vanity and hidden selfishness. In her lifetime, she had never truly loved anyone, and her good deeds were just a mask hiding her hypocrisy. Later, she confessed, I said that I sympathized with people's suffering, but in reality I had not a shred of real compassion. On the contrary, I believed that they deserved their misfortunes as a punishment. At the edge of this cursed abyss, she felt a heavy sense of shame. But despite her struggle, an invisible force dragged her further down into the black abyss. The pain and suffering surrounding her were infinite. At some point, she realized that the devil existed, and she even heard his mocking laughter. He enjoyed the suffering of people, just like herself, vain, envious, proud. Gloria Pola remembered, I saw many people who were in terrible agony. They moaned, screamed, made dreadful noises, and all of this filled me with horror. I cannot forget the suffering I went through. Years have passed, but every time I think about it, I cannot hold back my tears. They were unhappy, and I have great compassion for them. Then a faint light flashed in her soul, and although this light was barely perceptible, it drew the attention of the beings surrounding her. They tried to steal it, and Gloria realized that they could destroy her soul. In her desperation, she screamed, and this scream became her last farewell and prayer for salvation. Then a miracle happened. Through the darkness, light emerged, and she heard a voice telling her that she would be saved by the prayers of those who remembered her. She was given a second chance. Gloria Pola described her return from the realm of suffering and torment. When the voice of light spoke, as I called it, all the dark beings immediately recoiled in fear and fell to their knees, as if worshipping the Lord. And as I swore to make the most of the second chance in life, small lights began to appear in the darkness. They were the hearts of the people who honestly wished for my return. By following their light, I began to slowly leave this terrible place, which was the true hell. After crossing the boundary of our existence and seeing what truly happens in the afterlife, Gloria Pola said, the greatest deception and the most treacherous trick of the devil is that he spreads myths about his absence. But he exists, and sooner or later, he will show his power. The only way to avoid his influence is to live a fulfilled life by unfolding your inner spiritual light and not following selfish desires. Another dramatic experience was shared by another person, John, who also found himself in the afterlife after his heart stopped during an operation. He spoke of his experience beyond life. What I saw in the first moments after my death was so terrible that even the fact of my death faded into the background. The vision that opened before me filled me with such horror that it seemed as if my soul was trembling with fear. Although I had not believed in their existence before and thought it was foolish superstition. But now, everything that mattered was my soul and the experience it was about to undergo. In the first minutes in the afterlife, I desperately hoped it was just a nightmare and I would soon wake up in the familiar world. But unfortunately, these hopes were not fulfilled. The terrifying visions I saw were the true afterlife realm. And this clearly confirmed that much of what we were told about life after death was a complete lie. The truth was so terrifying that seemingly not everyone had the courage to speak it out loud. For John, everything began at the moment of cardiac arrest when his consciousness was carried away from his body like by a strong storm wind. He later recalled that after this event, there was no feeling of floating above the body or traveling through a tunnel with an end in light. Nothing good. Around him was only complete darkness. Then he found himself on an endless flat plain, populated to the horizon by evil, semi-transparent beings that only vaguely resembled humans. They were ugly, made of mist and ash. And yet, despite the seemingly hopeless situation John had found himself in, he noticed something that the beings, who were fighting with each other on the plain, did not perceive. He saw that someone was watching them, ready to help at any moment if they showed even the slightest intelligence and the will to free themselves from this terrible hell. They were higher beings, descending into the dark worlds out of compassion for the unfortunate, to lead those who were willing to go through purgatory out. John told this story to his cardiologist, Dr. Lommel, who, along with his medical team, brought him back to life. Dr. Pim Lommel dedicated much time to investigating the question of life after death. After numerous interviews with people who had experienced clinical death, he concluded that people encounter not only light but also darkness. Many of them reported a frighteningly dark space from which they could not escape. The memories of those who had such experiences were exclusively marked by negative emotions. Those who had been in the darkness felt such intense fear that they remained silent about what they had experienced for a long time. This was not surprising, as such places were meant for souls burdened with evil. When they returned to earthly life, they began to realize what would await them when death eventually claimed its due. This fear kept them from speaking about their experiences. Some, however, found the courage to share their experiences. One of Dr. Lommel's patients recounted that after his death, he found himself in a dark tunnel, then fell into it and plummeted headfirst at great speed. During the fall, he was surrounded by a terrifying laughter that sounded like screeching. Then, beings appeared, trying to catch him. The patient admitted that at the moment when he felt nothing but fear, he thought of God and began to pray. The fall stopped, and through the dreadful noise, he heard the voices of the doctors fighting for his life. After studying the accounts of his patients who had experienced the afterlife, Dr. Pim Lommel concluded that after death, souls are sorted by high and low vibrations. High vibrations indicate a person who was spiritually developed, performed many good deeds, and was selfless. Low vibrations characterize those who followed only their selfish desires in life. Souls with high vibrations enter the higher realms of the afterlife, while those with low vibrations go to places where they will suffer eternally and atone for their sins. He also noted, just as the universe has no beginning and no end, so our consciousness has no end. It continues to exist, gathering experiences in an invisible dimension where time is unlimited, and the past, present, and future are infinite. Therefore, death and birth are transitions from one state of consciousness to another. But studying the experiences of others is one thing, and experiencing it oneself is something entirely different. That's exactly what happened to anesthetist Rajiv Part 1, a skeptic who did not believe in the existence of the soul or the afterlife. However, in 2010, his life changed radically when he ended up in the intensive care unit due to a severe illness. On the operating table, his heart stopped beating, and the doctors declared him dead. Rajiv Part 1 found himself in a situation that completely changed his perspective on life and death. Initially, his soul separated from his body, and he began to rise, as a growing light formed around him. But suddenly, this light disappeared, and absolute darkness overtook him. He thought he would return to his body, but instead, he found himself in a terrifying situation. From the depth of the darkness, an unknown being approached him, triggering a deep fear within him. This phenomenon was accompanied by thunder, which instilled panic in him. Then, he suddenly found himself at the edge of an abyss, held by an inexplicable force. The fear he experienced was indescribable, and he realized that the angels he had heard of did not exist. All that remained was darkness, a place that consumed everything. And then, like in a terrible nightmare, he heard a mocking voice say, "You never truly loved anyone." These words were directed at him, and he understood that they were true. In his life, he had never truly loved anyone, seeing people merely as a source of income. In his fear and regret, he prayed to God for a chance at redemption. And at that very moment, he noticed the figure of a man. It was his father, who had died 20 years ago and with whom Rajiv had a complicated relationship. His father had been strict and harsh, but now, transformed, he helped Rajiv move away from the edge of the abyss and led him to a remarkable place where he met a being resembling an angel. The being explained to him that he must return to life, leave his career as an anesthetist behind, and focus on helping those experiencing emotional suffering. Rajiv accepted this second chance and returned to life, completely changing his destiny. He left his medical career and dedicated himself to working with people, helping them heal their emotional wounds while at the same time atoning for his own sins. After this incident, Rajiv Part 1 understood that life and death had a completely different meaning than he had originally thought. All of his beliefs about death and the afterlife changed. He was no longer a skeptic and began to believe in the existence of a spiritual world and that there was a deeper meaning to the experiences people go through after their death. His experience in the darkness and the core of his process of regret were crucial to changing his attitude toward life and the people around him. He gave up his previous career because he understood that his true calling was to help people not only physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. Rajiv Part 1 began working in a new field, advising and supporting people who were going through difficult phases in life. His experience changed not only his own life but also the lives of many others to whom he offered support and help. Over time, he began to tell his story in the hope that it could help others understand how his worldview had changed and how important it is to find harmony within oneself and appreciate every moment of life. He often recalled how his spiritual journey helped him understand not only the meaning of love and forgiveness but also that this experience truly has no end, because the spiritual path continues even after physical death. His story became a source of inspiration for many who may have felt lost or were stuck in dark moments. Since then, Rajiv Part 1 helped many people find their way to their inner world and true happiness by assisting them in rediscovering their faith in themselves and in the future.